Welcome back to another Mailbag Monday where Chris and I are tackling all of your questions each week. So this week, Chris, what question are we handling?
We have an interesting one from the recent Martech Coffee Talks from Marion asking, how do you plan on screening the data that comes out of a system like ChatGPT so that it is not skewed politically, religiously, racially, etc.?
Oh, man. That's an excellent question, Chris. This is something I feel like you've spent a lot of time researching and thinking about. So where would Marion start with this?
The short answer is you can't.
I was afraid that was going to be the answer. And before I said it, I wanted to make sure that was really true.
The place you need to start is to understand what biases exist in the model, right? So OpenAI has published this in their technical documentation. They've said, for example, we know that European names are favored with higher positive sentiment than African-American names, and that there are negative biases against African-American female names within the database, as an example. But here's the thing. The platform, the technology is the wrong place to be looking at this. Yes, you want to make sure that a data set that's been used to train it is as free of bias as possible. But even in the technical paper for GPT-4, they said there are some unusual trade-offs. To get more fair answers, they had to accept increased bias. They tried to reduce bias to zero, and it started creating unfair answers, answers that were outright slanderous. And so there's something in the way that we use language as human beings that was our trade-off. So I want to go back to the 5 Ps, right? The model, GPT-4, Bard, whoever, is the platform, the fourth P in platform. If you expect the model to do all this stuff and to not spit out things that are racially biased, you're essentially saying you've given up on the third P, which is process, right? The model is just a piece of software, just like Microsoft Word, right? Microsoft Word will create whatever you type into it, but it's the person doing the typing, and then the process for requirements gathering up front, and then the process for how you handle the output that is going to reduce or mitigate those biases. And you need to have QA processes in place to be able to do that, because if you don't, then you're going to get what you get out of the model, but that's kind of like throwing darts.
So in that instance, do you think that it's better to build your own model with your own data versus relying on something like a ChatGPT where you can't be sure, what that, sort of inside black box looks like?
If you have the technical capabilities to do so, yes, but that's not a small undertaking.
Sure.
And the harder part of fine tuning is actually system monitoring to see, like, okay, well, what is happening? You need some kind of reinforcement feedback loop in place to be able to say, okay, this was an appropriate response, this is not an appropriate response. And doing the QA on the model is actually the hardest part, because you're going to have it spit out 10,000 responses. And then guess what? You got to go through all 10,000, give it thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yeah, I think this is going to be, the conversation around the information that comes out of these kinds of models is only going to get bigger and more complicated. One of the famous examples, Chris, that you cite is the Amazon example, where they gave, the Amazon, data science models all of their historical hiring information to help find, the right candidates for people who were applying. And what they found out was that there was a strong gender bias in the model that they weren't fully aware of. They may have been aware of it and maybe thought the model wasn't aware of it, whatever the situation. And what ended up happening was the model, using the historical hiring information, developed a bias to only bring in male candidates as opposed to female candidates. And Amazon was able to identify this, but it's because it was their data. Now, when you're looking, so if Chris and I were to go into Amazon and go, oh, this looks like this, but we don't know Amazon data that well, we're at a disadvantage. And so when you're using systems like OpenAI, I don't think they're going out of their way to give you, biased and unethical data, but that's just sort of the reality of grabbing these data sets from all over the internet.
And in particular with language models, there are grades of bias, right? So I'll give you a real simple example. If a model spit out, something talking to me, and it said, "Hey, you gook," like, okay, clearly that is a racial slur, right?
Yikes, Chris.
Clearly that is not supposed to be there. That's
Oh
an
my
easy
God.
one to flag, right?
Sure.
If a model said, "Hey, let's double click on that," that is a corporate term for a certain age group, right? That other age groups, it's not in their lingo. So the model is speaking to people in a way that is targeted at one specific age group. That is a much more subtle form of bias, right? If you look at the way that people use language based on gender, there are differences in how different genders and different cultures use language. So is the model speaking in a way that is appropriate to the audience it's speaking to? These are all things that have to be in that process part of the 5 Ps, like and defined clearly as requirements. Like, yes, if we were speaking to somebody who is of a certain age, your language should not be substantially different than speaking to somebody from a different age group, right? If you're using it for a customer service application, it should not treat people different, even if they are using language that is specific to them and their age group, right? My dad will say things that, hold your horses, Charlie Brown, he'll say. And like, that is an expression that nobody under 60 says.
I mean, I say hold your horses, and I'm under 60. But no, and I think, Chris, to your point around the process part of it, it's not enough to say in your prompt, speak to me like I'm a woman or speak to me like I'm a man.
Oh,
That
God,
is the
don't do that.
absolute wrong way to be approaching, to make sure that you are cutting out the bias, because all you're doing is introducing an additional layer of bias into the output that you're likely to get. And so in the background section of that prompt engineering, which you can find on trustinsights.ai in our insights, that's where you want to include all of those things to take out. So for example, just a really terrible example, because I'm a woman, I could, program this and say, every time I talk to ChatGPT, I want it to respond with, "Hey, girlfriend," or "Hey, bitch." That's a terrible example. But if Chris were then like, "Why is it suddenly calling me girlfriend?" Like, actually, that would be kind of funny. I think I need to figure out how to do this now. But, you don't want to introduce bias by saying, "I am a woman, speak to me like I'm a woman." That's the absolute backwards way to reduce bias in these kinds of data sets.
Or in general.
Yes. But
The
we're
bottom
keeping it
line,
focused here.
the bottom line here is, and I think Marianne's asking the right kinds of questions. The bottom line is, you should always be asking the question, what could go wrong? What could go wrong as we're deploying this thing? What are the things, how could this thing go off the rails? And then do we have sufficient protections in the process portion of our 5 Ps to reduce the likelihood and the impact of when these things go wrong? I think it's a great question and an interesting question. If you've got questions that you'd like to ask for a Mailbag Monday, pop on over to our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,000 other marketers are asking questions like this every single day. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes, go to trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Subscribe there. You'll get the updates every week. Thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you next time.